So I'm Brendan Guenther. I'm the Director of Virtual University Design and Technology. I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the policy and legal implications of turning on and using Google Analytics to collect site statistics and web usage stats. We've been using it for years, actually, without realizing that we were in violation of a bazillion MSU policies in my unit. So I think that's how I got stuck with this presentation. We discussed it in the LCNT senior staff meeting, the directors meeting, back in February. And we deemed it to be kind of a low risk, I think, from a legal standpoint, in that there are a lot of nasty things in the Google Analytics terms of service that our general counsel's office would object to in principle for any contracts. These are things that we fight over when we're actually negotiating contracts on behalf of the university. Things like, blanket indemnification clauses, or we being MSU, promise to pay all of Google's legal bills should either of us get sued relative to use of Google Analytics. And some of those issues, although I think we're probably right that it's probably a low risk that use of Google Analytics would result in the university being sued, we're going to run past council one last time before we say, yeah, let's go ahead and just turn on Google Analytics on every site in the university that wants to use it. That being said, we think that we can probably come to terms. We've successfully managed to get a Google Apps for Education contract signed with Google recently, so we have some hope that council will give us some guidance on which sites maybe we shouldn't use it for and what areas are of concern. There's always a remote possibility that we could roll some of the terms of service into the kind of contract that we agreed to for the Apps for Education. So it seems like there's enough of a chance that this will go forward that it's worth talking about. There's a lot of implications for people that maintain sites if you are to use this. So I'm going to assume that you kind of know a lot about site statistics already, that you're probably gathering site statistics from your site in some way, and you understand the value of analytics. In a nutshell, Google Analytics is comparable to a lot of the open source stuff that I assume people are already using, or the other commercial products that have been on the market for years. Google bought Urchin, which is a website, a web analysis company that we've used on www.msu.edu and some of the other centrally maintained sites for quite a while. So their technology and their legal agreements read a lot like that. This is a cloud-based service, though. And like all of these things, it uses a tracking cookie that's set in the browser. And it's a fairly persistent cookie to track over time a user's use of the web. I think one of the key differences between Google Analytics and anything that you run locally, this tracking cookie is used in common across all sites on the web. Most local products either analyze log files or use a local session cookie to track. And so you don't get this kind of comprehensive everything that I've done on the web view in a database. Mind you, when I use Google Analytics on our sites, I can only see your activity on my site. But in the Google Data Store, they can piece that together across all of your activity on the web. This creeps out privacy advocates for obvious reasons, I think. So in a nutshell, it's how people found your site, how they explored it, what their quick path was. You can use this information for a variety of ways. We use it to enhance our website. We use it to understand who's using our website, what the audience is, which pages are popular, which sections are working, and which are not. Generally, that helps you increase conversions. And in the capital world, that tends to be sales. But even on sites like MSU maintains, that could be listserv subscribers. It could be active participants in a forum that you run on your site. It could be incoming freshmen that are interested in your major. It could be a variety of things. And conversions don't always happen on the web. Sometimes you'd be tracking that metric someplace else and hoping that increased website traffic has some correlation to some other number or metric that you have. But if you track these statistics over time, we put together some pretty successful funding arguments over time, both internally and with on behalf of some of the contracts that we have for the foundations that support them in the case of small nonprofits. One little thing about AdWords there, and I'm going to bring this up later probably too, but you can tie this together with AdWords, and AdWords is the way that you get free Google Analytics service forever. Otherwise, there's a page view limit. 5 million page views after that, you're not allowed to use it for free. You have to set up an AdWords account. And AdWords brings into play a lot of stuff that kind of is beyond the scope of what I want to get into today. When I talked to David Gift about it recently, he reminded me that MSU has a policy about, in the traditional built physical environment, about advertising. And advertising has to be board approved That's why we go through university relations in a lot of cases to help us prepare advertising, because they're familiar with what will get approved and what won't. This policy doesn't speak specifically to the web, but it probably applies in the web. So I know of some departments that are doing AdWords campaigns for a variety of reasons, and I'm not entirely sure if they're on the reservation or off the reservation. I just would encourage you, if someone asks you to start an AdWords campaign for your site, to make sure that there's some thought about whether or not what you're doing complies with MSU's expectations around advertising. So there's a number of steps that you have to get into, and these are almost all have legal or policy implications in the MSU environment. You have to agree to the Google Terms of Service. I'm going to assume everyone in this room has probably agreed to the Google Terms of Service at some point already for a variety. If you've used anything Google, you've agreed to the Google Terms of Service. If you have a Gmail account, if you used MSU Google Apps for Education to a certain extent, we agreed to the Terms of Service on your behalf. When you sign in with your NetID, you're writing on our agreement to the Terms of Service. And then those are slightly modified. And that's really the only difference, by the way, between our Google Apps for the MSU Google Apps and Google Apps out in the world. There are a few legalistic differences. It's hosted in the same place, it's the same code, it's running all the same place. We just tweaked a couple of little sentences in their Terms of Service. That's not really the sensitive one, I don't think, since probably most people are agreeing as an individual to set up a Gmail username and password. Probably if you're going to use Google Analytics, you should consider creating the Analytics profile not with your personal Google account, but set up a new Google account on behalf of your department. Have that username or password assigned by your IT people, or whoever it is holds the keys to the electronic kingdom, so to speak, in the department, and generally does access control across all systems. The reason being, we made the mistake of having staff set it up, and when they leave, by their grace, they continue to do access control for us and share out that access, but the original owner of the profile is an individual, and this is probably better done on an institutional basis. You have to agree to the Google Analytics Terms of Service, and that's the messy one that has, I would say, several red flags in it that we're going to work with counsel on. What I'm going to stick to today are the things in the Terms of Service that are particularly pertinent to you as someone who might implement Google Analytics. Immediately after agreeing to the Google Analytics Terms of Service, you'll have an opportunity to set preferences on the privacy of your data related to that the tracker collects. Now I'll get into that a little bit here. The next step would be, now you have a profile, you probably configured a site for it, you've got privacy settings for it, would be to actually distribute access to the reports that are generated from the data. This is, mind you, prior to data collection, but so that they have access to the profile, you'd give that access to other people, and they will have to set up their own Google accounts and agree to the Terms of Service in order to do that. But that's how we do it. I think there's probably 7-8 people in our office that have access to every single site's profile, depending on who needs that information. So prior to actually deploying the tracking code, because as soon as you do that, you're going to start collecting data, you should audit your site. There's a number of things to look for that derive from the Terms of Service, and I'll get into that. And you should establish a privacy policy. These are actually legally mandated by the agreement with Google. So these are the kind of the key things, and I took out a lot of the things that the lawyers will object to. But it does have a 5 million page FUI limit. You and third parties that you contract to do your site or that are involved in hosting your site, that kind of thing, must not collect personally identifiable information and associate it with the tracking cookie. So for instance, if we were to put this on www.msu.edu, probably the fact that my homepage includes my MSU NetID and therefore can fairly easily be traced back to my identity probably doesn't count as this. But if, for instance, every time I logged into the site, for instance, if it actually had a login that was required every time, so if it was Angel, for instance, if it was obvious who I was in the course of logging in and it was displayed in the URL such that it would be captured by the tracking cookie, that would be a no-no. And so probably the easiest way to do this as a web developer is probably to look through your access log and use some kind of search tool to search for things that look like they might be personally identifiable, whether it's an email address, names. I'm not going to be so ridiculous to suggest that anyone would ever put a social security number in a URL, but who knows, maybe somewhere, certainly not at MSU. But search through your site and audit it essentially to see whether or not you think you might be exposing people to personally identifiable information. I think this is especially true for web applications. So if you were to install off-the-shelf software like Drupal or WordPress or something like that, just evaluate probably its profiles, things like that, areas in the site where the username likely would be embedded in the URL. Since we're talking about MSU, if you run an actual application of some sort, like AIS would, probably you want to make sure that your search parameters and things like that actually make use of data that is in a database behind the site doesn't expose not necessarily the person browsing the web's user data, but other data which we would consider private or confidential.